Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another IFAS AI seminar. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Alina Zare. She teaches and conducts research in machine learning and AI as a professor in the Electrical and Computer Engineering Department at University of Florida. She also serves as the director of the Artificial Intelligence and Informatics Institute, also at UF. Dr. Zare's research has focused primarily on developing new machine learning algorithms to automatically understand and process data and imagery. Her work has included automated plant root phenotyping, subpixel hyperspectral image analysis, target detection, underwater scene understanding using synthetic aperture sonar, LiDAR data analysis, ground penetrating radar analysis, and buried landmine explosive hazard detection. Please welcome Dr. Zare.
Thank you. All right, so good afternoon. Thank you for having me. So today I'm going to talk about some of the work from my lab, the machine learning and sensing lab that we're doing. And I'll end the talk with one slide of a general discussion of what I'm planning to do in the AI and Informatics Research Institute, because it's still early days there, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But I'll start with the research work. I'm going to talk about getting artificial neural networks or deep learning systems to be able to say, I don't know. And I'm going to start out by talking about some applications that we're using artificial neural networks for and the motivation for why we want that. And then later I'll talk about addressing ambiguous inputs, which is a little bit different. Okay. So before I get into that, just an introduction to my group. We work in a variety of application areas. I started my career doing defense work, so funded by the Army and the Navy to do explosive hazard detection. And I was giving a talk. I was an assistant professor at the time at the University of Missouri, and I gave a seminar on some of our work in buried landmine detection, and a colleague in Missouri in the plant science department. So if you can find buried landmines, can you find plant roots? I said, I have no idea, but let's give it a shot. And so now, over a decade later, still doing work in plant and soil phenotyping, but have branched out into other areas of agriculture and forest ecology and other stuff. The students that we work in a lot of application areas, but the students that graduate from my group do PhDs in foundational AI work. So they use this to motivate what can our AI systems now do, and then they have dissertations that try and fill that gap. Okay, so that's who I am, just so you know a little bit about my work. And so I'm going to talk about this idea of getting deep learning systems to be able to say, I don't know. There's two parts. The first is null space analysis. It's really addressing this I don't know question. And the second part is the histogram layer, which is addressing ambiguous inputs. It's a little bit different, but they're tied together by sometimes we have just strange and weird inputs to our systems, and we need ways to deal with them. Okay. And I love questions. Interrupt me at any time. Okay. So part one, this null space analysis, enabling neural networks to say, I don't know. So just some examples of projects we've worked on in which the core of the method is a artificial neural network or some sort of deep learning architecture. Okay, so we have some work that's actually just wrapping up now. I'm sad because it's been a great several years. Hopefully I'll get to work with the team again, led by Ethan White in IFAS. I'm looking at tree crown detection, delineation, and then species classification. And so you can go to this visualizeidtrees.org. It's a great site that was put together by Ben Weinstein and Ethan's team. And I'm sure what you'll do is you'll find some places we got it wrong. But by and large, it's really great. Okay, so 100 million trees plus being detected and working on species classification of each of them. And the background for this is a deep artificial neural network. Okay. I talked about some of our work in plant root phenotyping. This is imagery from mini rhizotron tubes. So these are clear plastic tubes they put into the field. And you send a camera down them, take pictures of the root and soil. And then we're doing things like, well, the first thing we did was just detect the roots. But now we are looking at quantifying root turnover and then doing automated phenotyping things, root length, diameter, color, these sorts of things. Okay, again, neural networks at the base of this, right? We have a new project that's funded by USDA NEPA looking at X-ray CT scans of field collected soil cores. So in prior work, and this is in collaboration with some folks at the University of Missouri, Felix Ritchie, and then also our collaborator, Tom Younger at UT Austin. In prior collaborations with them, they collected a very large number of soil cores. Okay, and I've got really impressive videos of them. They collect them really fast. They go down the field, got thousands of them. It's pretty impressive. Then we took these soil cores. This is just a piece of one. They were pretty deep, and put them through an X-ray CT machine. We were primarily we tried out a bunch of them. We have one here at Florida. There's one at UT Austin. They've got a group. And they also have an X-ray CT machine at the vet school in the University of Missouri. And we had most of our soil cores from Missouri, so instead of shipping things around, most of our data is in this X-ray CT from the vet school there. And so we get these 3D volumes, and then we want to do similar things, detect the roots, measure their diameter, these sorts of things, okay? All right, and so that's going on right now. And we're looking at deep neural networks and artificial graph neural networks for that. My last example of some of our work, and again, it's a root example, is this is in collaboration with Bill Hammond and Sanjeev Kopal, who's in the ECE department with me, Stefan Gerber and Chris Wilson, also here at UF. And we collected hyperspectral imagery of rhizotron boxes. So grew roots in these thin boxes with a side that we could take the cover off, and we put it through a hyperspectral scanner. And so we have 3D hyperspectral data gives you spatial dimensions as well as spectral. So you're getting, instead of just a color photo, RGB, you're getting hundreds of reflectances across a range of wavelengths. And then we're doing a number of analyses with this, and this particular one that we're showing is predicting volumetric water content. Okay, and we have, for all these examples, we have data sets, and we're happy to collaborate. Thanks. Okay, but just like all the other ones, we've got some deep net doing our work for us, right? Now, it's great. It seems like these models can solve everything, but they're not great when they see things that are unlike what they've seen in training data. And so sometimes you just get unexpected inputs when you're working in the real world, right? So this is from their ID Trees project. It called this glint over water a tree. Yeah, it's not a tree. Now that we know it did that, we can get a bunch of examples over water and say, this is not a tree, and it'll do better on that. But we didn't think to add that early on, right? And when you're deploying these systems, you're going to come across something that you didn't think about, okay? So many years doing buried landmine detection, there's going to be a soda can, there's going to be a paper clip, something in the field that you didn't think about that's going to trip your algorithm up, and it's going to think, oh, that looks like a landmine, right? And what do you want your system to do in those situations? Lots of things that confuse the systems and roots. I'm showing some examples of condensation, bugs, all sorts of things, okay? Again, if we know that this is a confuser, we can add it, but we rarely know every confuser we might come across in advance, okay? So what would you like your system to do when it comes across something it doesn't know? I would argue we want it to be able to say, I don't know what this is. This doesn't look like what I've seen before, okay? Instead of forcing a response. You know, deep learning methods, really, as we all know, they're best for methods where we have large amounts of training data. And where our training data adequately covers all the cases we'll see in tests. And so when we see unexpected examples, they tend to act a little strangely. We're way better at this than when I first made this slide. But they are still best at well-defined classes and outputs, but we're much better at sort of ambiguous things. So I'll talk more about that later. Okay, all right, so I have a pop quiz. I'm continuing to motivate Y1 networks to say, I don't know. These are handwritten characters. What characters do you think these are? What's the first one? Just call it out. Okay, H-A, Q, H-N, 9 or Q,
V or J?
U-V-J. I hear you go. CO. How confident are you?
Us.
Are you very confident?
We do like that.
No,
You serious?
Okay,
The left one.
so just the answer. These are from a USPS data set of handwritten addresses. So it was TTA for Marietta and these others.
So yes.
But when you were looking at those, you could give a response, but you were also able to say, I'm not sure, right? Our networks are not as good as that, right? So there's a lot of work in uncertainty estimation and different things. I'm going to talk about a certain piece of it. I gave this same image to ChatGPT. I said, how good is it going to do? It said symbols represent chemical elements from the periodic table. Okay, probably because of the spacing. You know, it's not HA as well, but it's been trained to say, given the handwriting, some interpretations may vary. Okay, so it's gotten enough handwriting examples that it knows it gets wrong, that puts in this caveat at the end. If I give it sort of a more active example, so I have images from a UAV over a field. These are corn, young maize plants. What's in this image? It says rows of crops planted in the field. What kind of plants? Amazingly, it's seen enough corn. It says young corn maize plants. I have many examples where it does not get the plant type correct. But how many plants are in the image? It says 7,000, it's off by an order of magnitude. Okay, it's way overestimating. This time, it hasn't seen enough examples of this to know to say, I'm not sure, right? So even these are amazing systems, but they have this issue of not having good competency awareness. And so we really need to be able to, so there's many aspects to competency awareness. The part I'm talking about.
Sorry, on the previous
Yes.
one, was there a caveat on the number?
No, there's no caveat.
So it was just given like that, and people will trust it.
Yes.
Wow.
Very wrong, right? It's seen enough handwriting examples to know to give a caveat, right? So there was enough human in the loop feedback that you're getting it wrong. Not enough examples here to know to give a caveat, right? I'm obviously not involved in the this LLM development, but I imagine they forced that in there after the fact, right? With the caveat. Just didn't get around to this one yet. So how can we do that in an automated way? Instead of having someone come in and say, oh, we keep on getting these handwriting examples wrong. We need to automate our competency awareness. Many aspects to competency awareness, many people are looking at it. I'm just going to talk about in this first part of the talk, can we identify when an input sample is different from everything it's trained on? And be able to say, I don't know, I haven't seen something like this before. Okay. So, you know, this aspect of competency awareness commonly called out of distribution detection. There's a lot of approaches in the literature. I'm going to probably be overly blunt, but I think supervised approaches are just silly. What they tend to do is they have your training data, and as a part of the training data, they give examples that say these are outliers. Well, if you know the examples in advance, you don't need, you just train on it, right? we need to be able to address those that we don't think of, okay? So to me, the unsupervised approaches make a lot more sense. Many methods in the literature, they tend to use prototypes, like representing the training data in various ways, either features, spaces in the network, identifying high confidence inliers and other things like this, okay? I also want to say there's lots of different types of outliers, and there's probably not one method that's gonna always work. And it's just like a truth in AI and machine learning is ensemble methods tend to do better than single methods. I think that's gonna be true of competency awareness. We're gonna need a suite of these methods working in concert for any major system. But I think I have a good one to add to the group, okay? So, to bring you down, usually we go to these deep learning talks, and there are these big pictures of architectures, and I'm trying to bring you down to think about the little components within them, right? So a deep learning system is made of a collection of neurons, right? And each neuron is really just defining a decision boundary in some feature space, right? And a deep learning system is a whole collection of these. And whenever you go from one layer to the next, you can represent it as this matrix multiplication, right? The input feature coming into the layer multiplied by the matrix of weights that defines that layer, and then you put through an activation function to get to the next layer. Okay, so if you remember way back in your undergrad linear algebra days, whenever you go from, when this is a non-square matrix, when you're going from a large layer to a smaller layer, this operation has a non-trivial null space, which essentially means there's parts of the data it's ignoring. It's just throwing it away, not to get to zero. So I don't need to pay attention to that. Okay. And the whole idea of our null space analysis is, can we look at what it's ignoring to identify if this is something we've seen before or not? Okay, so I'll talk about that more. Okay, yes, so this work is being led by my PhD student, Matt Cook. And again, every time we go from a larger layer to a smaller layer, we have a non-trivial null space. That's throwing stuff away. The network's ignoring that information from that point forward. Okay, so for example, if you're like detecting cars, and I mean, this is overly simplistic, it's more complicated than that, but it decides color is not an important piece of information. Maybe it throws all the color information into the null space and ignores that moving forward. Okay. So this is, I should have animated this, but this is a picture of Matt's dog. So he's getting that picture too. Okay, he trained a simple network to detect dogs. Okay, and so he trained that network, and the network can very accurately say this is a dog. Okay, I have a question for you. Is this image, if I showed you this image and this image and asked you, are they the same image? What would you say? No, they're not the same image. Okay, what Matt did was he sampled from the null space in the input layer. Okay, from the input to that first layer, he went down in dimension, so I had a non-trivial null space. And he sampled from that null space and made this noise image. And he added that to the dog to make this, okay? Now the network, because this is ignored, it's from the null space, it's ignored by the network. The network says, I'm 100% confident this is a dog. And not only does it say this is a dog, but every single feature value, every value through every part of the network is identical between this image and this image. You can't tell it apart because it throws that information away. Okay. Now we look at this and say they're nothing alike. right? So this is the motivation for the whole idea. If we look at what's being thrown into the null space, we can see, is that similar to what's ignored in our training data? Right? And if they're similar, then we say, okay, this is similar to our training data. We can trust the output. If they're very different, we can say this is unlike our training data. It's not something I've seen before. I may need to have a human in the loop or look at this more closely. Okay. That makes sense. Any questions? All right. So pretty much,
Alina, can we say that null space is like a noise?
so it can have structure to it. It's really just anything that's being ignored by the network. We have some ongoing research threads where we're looking at purposefully ignoring stuff, saying, I'm going to give an example that we're not working in, but it's a motivating example for us. Often it's like if you're talking about college admissions, perhaps there's certain demographic information you don't want to use into making your decisions. A naive thing might be to just eliminate race from the application. But we know that there's correlates in all the other parts of the application. And so could we instead take all the parts of the input that are related to race, for example, and force them into the null space so the decision is not made on that? We're not actually working on that, but this is the conceptual idea. When we looked at that, there is structure in there. We're purposefully putting structure in the null space. If you don't guide the null space and you sample from it, it tends to look like noise.
I ask a question, but here this network was trained with the actual images. It's not that the network was trained also with images plus the noise that we see.
No, it's just trained on images. This is like a motivating example.
Yeah, it's possible, I guess, to perturb the image of the dog with some structured noise, and the network would recognize it as a cat. So that's
Yeah, so like an adversarial sort of example. Yeah. I think we could try to make the network more robust to noise like this in a purposeful way. I think, I know our motivating is there are things that we're not going to think of to train in advance. And we want to examine null space to identify those as they come up without having to train for them at the front end, right? It's the same between that difference of a supervised outlier detection and not. If we know that it's something we should ignore, then absolutely we're going to train on it. But we're always going to come across stuff that we didn't think of.
Yeah, is that noise extracted from the null space or is okay? It's
Yeah,
not simulated.
noise from the null space.
Independent.
Yeah, so this is being sampled from the null space and this is just motivating, right? The motivating example. We know the network's going to ignore this. We know the network is mapping that entire image to noise because it's being sampled from null space. And so to the network, these two images are absolutely identical, which is odd to us as people. Right. So we have actually a lot of different threads and trying to work on this. We've thought about purposefully putting stuff in the null space. We've thought about using the null space for structure, learning of the network, all sorts of things. But where we started was really just outlier detection. And this is the focus of Matt's thesis. He developed this somewhat simple term called the null space analysis term, or NUSA. And it just takes an input sample, projects it on the null space, normalizes it. And while we train, and so we started with, we're just going to compute how much of this input is ignored, how much goes into the null space. And you can do that in threshold and find some outliers. We perform much better when we add this term to our objective function. And we minimize it. We say for all our training data, ignore as little as possible. Okay. And then during test, we can compute this for any test sample, and if it's above our threshold, then we say this is an outlier, unlike something we've seen before. And This is our cross entropy loss. And if we look at our Newsom minimization loss, what tends to happen is we ignore a bunch of stuff. And then we start to not ignore it, right? And so we have this balance between those two terms that we look at. Okay, so we minimize our null space projections during training. Here's a small example. We took a well-known computer image data set called CFAR10. We trained classification on it, it's standard classification task. We got all the data and projected its null, the samples of all the data from the data set using TSNE of the null space. So this is the null space of all those samples. And then if we take another data set and we say this data set's outliers, right? It's unlike our original, and did the same, it's null space projections sort of fall into different parts of the space. And so the idea is it's a different distribution, we can sort of tell them apart. If we look at the impact of classification, including and not including the null space term, it tends to be very minimal impact. So we still have our classification performance, but we get this added benefit of being able to detect outliers. We've done a lot of comparisons to outlier detection methods. Every time Matt submits it for review, one of the review comments is, why don't you compare to this one? And so we're in this endless cycle of comparing to other methods and resubmitting it. I hope it gets finalized one of these days. But like any algorithm, there's no free lunch. It's going to work well in some cases and not in others. But for a lot of baseline outlier detection problems, we do outperform comparison approaches. Okay, so that's the first part, how we're trying to do outlier detection and really analyzing the null space projections to be able to say, I don't know. Part two is looking at ambiguous inputs, and we're doing this in a way that we're calling the histogram layer. Okay, and so I'll motivate this as well. So this is different from outliers. These are samples that sort of live in between classes. Okay, our motivation for this work was some of our sonar image analysis work, because we were trying to do automated scene understanding of sonar imagery. So this is imagery of the ocean floor. We're saying, where's their sand ripple? Where's their seagrass? Where's their hardpack sand? What is the angle of that sand ripple? How high are the troughs? All these sorts of things. We had a bunch of people label these imagery, and they could say there's sand ripple here, there's seagrass here, but they rarely agreed on the boundary, right? And that's just because there's no crisp boundaries. Things sort of morph from one class into the other, right? So we have these ambiguous samples that it's hard to assign a class to it. Okay. Now, one thing before I go to this, when we were working on this, our conversations really centered around texture. How do we characterize the texture of a particular image snippet? Okay. Texture is something people have been looking at in the computer vision image analysis community for decades. It's hard to define. So we're adding just like one more way of trying to capture it to that large suite of ways. Okay, if we look at our ID trees example, some of these, this is looking at an RGB image, you can easily tell some tree crowns from the other. But some, perhaps the color is very similar, and the best way to tell those trees apart is really some sort of texture. The leaves or the texture characteristics from one tree to the next are slightly different. Okay, and so this goes back to that sort of, there are these samples that lie in between classes, a little bit ambiguous. Can we characterize those samples more effectively? Okay. So really, how do we capture texture? If you go back in time, my son is really interested in time travel right now. But I don't think he would choose to go back into the early 2010s, but this is where I'm gonna ask you to go. If you go back to the early 2010s, computer vision community was all about coming up with features, right? I think probably 2011, the number of times I said local binary patterns in the day is like huge. I don't know what it was. But there are many, we'd extract these elaborate features and put them in a support vector machine and say, wow, we got amazing results, state-of-the-art results at the time, right? Now, what many of those effective features had in common was something very simple. They tended to characterize the data using a histogram. They would compute some sort of feature from the data and then summarize it in the histogram. How many of each one of these feature values are we getting in this spatial window? Okay, right, so LBP had some complicated thing, but at the end, they had bins and counts in each of those bins, okay? So these were great at characterizing textures. They were manually sort of traditionally designed, right? And in the era of deep learning, we've left them by the wayside. The hope for this work is saying, well, these were actually very effective. The thing that tied them together was this histogram. Could we bring that representation into our deep learning architectures? And perhaps that can better address certain types of textures and some of these ambiguous inputs. Okay. All right, so I'm talking about computer vision tasks right now. Most computer vision deep learning architectures are based on convolutions. And convolutions are good at what I'm going to call structural texture, but they're not good at what I'm going to call statistical texture. And I'll define these. So I have pairs of rows, okay, where the first is a checkerboard pattern. The next two is this cross pattern, and the third is a stripe, okay? A convolution can tell those apart very easily. If you want to classify checkerboard, cross, and stripe, do it with a convolution, okay? Now, in each of pairs of columns, the foreground is either sampled from a multinomial, a binomial, or a constant. That's what we're calling statistical texture, okay? A convolution can learn that, but not easily. It's not good at statistical texture. Okay. Just to sort of motivate that, we've got our simple, statistical distributions that we're sampling for the foreground. Often you train these with some random weight initialization. If we take random weights, or if we take those samples and we multiply it by a random convolution, you can't tell those three apart. And it's going to be a lot of work to get a convolution to tell them apart. You can, usually with multiple layers, but a histogram would tell this apart very easily. Okay, so can we just characterize that more directly? This is a slide saying, oh, you also, a big part of texture is also scale. And so, if you took a global histogram of both of these, they're identical. But if we took local windows, we can tell them apart. And so we're going to look at local histogram characterizations of features in the network. Okay, so this is all building up as, can we do a better job of representing these statistical textures? So samples from some statistical distribution in deep learning model. Yes, of course, we're going to do it with our histogram layers. This was work started by my former PhD student, Josh Peoples. He's now a tenure track assistant professor at Texas A&M. And Spencer Chang is a current student who's working with both of us to continue this work. Okay. And so, a standard histogram, you have your image or your feature values. We're just sliding a window over them, counting how many times you see each value. Okay, this standard histogram does not lend itself very easily to a modern deep learning architecture. Okay, so we tweaked it by essentially having soft histograms. We represent each histogram bin with the radial basis function. Okay, and so for every sample, we're saying how far it is from the center of a bin, and the width of that bin is just divided by this parameter. Okay, so we have this soft histogram approximation. Now, if we use this formulation, we can implement it within any deep learning package using standard functions that you find in that package. Okay, so it's a very straightforward implementation. We have a couple convolutions where we hold values fixed to certain things to force a subtracting the mean or multiplying by that bin width. Okay. And then, as a simple example, we went back to that little toy problem. We generated many samples in these 9 classes, right? A checkerboard multinomial, binomial, constant, and so on. And we trained a very simple convolution network, and a very simple histogram network that didn't use any convolutions. It was only this soft histogram. And then we trained a network that combined the two. But we tried to keep their parameters as similar as we could to each other. So this is not an effect of how big the networks are. It's really trying to compare the convolution operation, this histogram operation, and then the combination of the two. And it does exactly what you'd expect. If we look at those structural textures, the convolution does best. If we look at, so that's telling the rows apart. We're trying to tell the statistical textures apart. The histogram layer does best. And if you put them both together, you outperform all of it. You can detect, you can separate all 9. Okay. And so this is a pitch for using this histogram layer within your networks. When we looked at the sonar data, we were able to get a boost in performance, particularly in these ambiguous classes, of sort of aligning them in the space where they made most sense. Josh also looked at classifying adipose tissue and biopsies. He did it. I just love to show this because he had such a clever architecture name, the jointly optimized spatial histogram unit architecture, or Joshua. And so, he trained Joshua. It's a modification of the unit. So instead of just these standard skip layers, he made them histogram layers. And then he shows that he had a couple variations of the architecture, and one of his Joshua variations outperformed the comparison for the I don't know how to close that. Okay. Outperformed the standard unit. Then what's also really cool, I think, is we had these historical features pre-deep learning era that were really effective. Now we can train them within an architecture. We can say, oh, I want to use an edge histogram detector within my neural net. Edge histogram detectors is like the basis for JPEG compression. And so we can do what we're calling a neural edge histogram detector. You have a histogram layer and you constrain it to say, make sure the features being passed into it are edges, which is what VHD does. And we get histograms of those. And we're able to train. So back in the day, EHD had parameters that you would hand set, right? You'd run a bunch of experiments, you say, okay, I'm going to have this many bins, I'm going to have this bin width, and this is the number of edge masks I'm going to run. But now we can train all those through backpropagation with this histogram layer. And you can see when you compare, we looked at a few data sets, including our plant root data set. We compared sort of this best we could do with the traditional EHD with a network trained neural EHD, and we could get better results with neural EHD, which is not surprising because no one's hand tuning parameters, we're training it through backpropagation. Okay, so neural EHD outperformed. Okay, so that's the second part. All credit goes to the lab because they do all the amazing hard work. And that's it. That's the their talk from my personal research. As was mentioned in my introduction, I am also now the director of the Artificial Intelligence and Informatics Research Institute. Its formal name right now is Interdisciplinary Informatics and Artificial Intelligence Research Institute. We're going through a name change. I have one more approval we're waiting on. And so this is the name that will probably be moving forward once that last approval comes through. But it's early days. I started in November, so we're, a month, and I'm doing things like setting up the website and getting support staff hired and allocating space. Okay, but I'm going to talk about the vision, and I'd love to hear from you what you'd like from the Institute. I will say that I think, very broadly, there's three big buckets that the Institute will focus on. One is internal community, so building our internal AI community. Second is building external visibility. And then the last bucket is research support. What tools and services we can provide that support the AI research across campus. Some of the things I'm thinking about, and again, open to suggestions and thoughts. For that internal community building, we're thinking about a series of mini symposia. And let me explain that a bit more. We have really fantastic symposia that happen on an annual basis, like the AI Squared Center has AI days. There's been the Hypergator Symposium. There's been many large annual symposia that shows us the breadth of AI research being done on campus. So I don't think I need to add to that. What I'm thinking is 2 or 3 mini symposia a year that are very focused topics, with the idea of bringing together researchers across campus that haven't met each other but should, and bringing in external speakers from industry, government agencies, and possibly other universities. Okay, I'm thinking about it probably being some sort of application process with an external board making selections of what those are. That's brainstorming. It may all change, but that's the direction I'm heading, as opposed to multi-day broad symposia. Let's have a series of very focused ones where you're getting to meet people that you didn't know before, but hopefully will be fruitful to know moving forward. And we can bring in external people to see what we're doing and make those connections. For external visibility, I'm hoping to set up an external advisory board to help guide that. There's many ideas there as well. And then that last bucket of research support, a lot of opportunity and ideas there as well. One thing that has been talked about is an AI safety toolkit. So in many of my discussions, folks have brought up data governance, AI ethics repeatedly. Perhaps we can have one-on-one sessions or a toolkit that's created to help people navigate that as they're starting a project. And there's been some discussion with the Renwick program out of the College of Engineering for that. Other ideas, there's proposal support, right? Really looking at large 5 million and up or center level proposals. Let's get support to you to write those well, so you can focus on the technical content and have the rest of the stuff alleviated. Those are just ideas. More than welcome for suggestions and thoughts on what you hope to see from the Institute. I'll let you know when the website's up, because that's
Yes.
current day.
For research support, we first thought about using Hypergator, but you need to pay, right? And we need to we ended up purchasing our own GPU and use it in our lab. But how much money you have there? Can you support us like GPU usage?
Yeah, so there has been programs, so in the past, in the former incarnation of this, I'm not tying myself to the Informatics Institute, I'm viewing this as a new institute, but previously, the Informatics Institute did have some of these awards, granting seed funding, which I hope to continue some version of that, but also granting resources to Hypergator. So that's a possibility. And I think the big thought is, you know, we can have seed awards, we can have Hypergator resources awarded. And we can also hire grant writers and graphic developers, these sorts of things. And the question is, how much do we put in each pot, right? And so I'm hearing from you is the GPU access is a priority.
Alina, maybe, so we got one of the recent large computational AI grants, this year.
Yes.
And then there goes the question, there is more to computational informatics than AI. Are you gonna balance the act, or are you just gonna go full control into AI disregarding the other?
Oh, it's AI and informatics.
Yes, but I've heard you only talking about.
Yeah,
AI,
I'm
so
using
this-
AI as a shortcut. But yes.
But I think it's important to keep, or even develop now in the world of AI, that there are mechanistic approaches that could be or not enhanced by AI, particularly on the input side and so on, but still we need to make core advancements in fundamental
Yeah.
standard systems, so. Yeah,
I
always-
absolutely agree, and I'll say, just my personal opinion. And, in a year or two, you all can come back and tell me I'm wrong, but I think these large, the LLMs and things are gonna start to plateau. There's some news that there's evidence of that, I don't know if that's how valid that is or not. But essentially, we're gonna, start running out of new large data sources to train these on, right? And in some problem domains, right? So if we look at agriculture in various environmental conditions, it's going to be impossible to collect data for every plant species in every location in every environmental condition, right? And so the blend of traditional modeling with AI and really good, data science and informatics is going to be the only path forward, in my opinion.
I think the generalization value comes from the mechanics of understanding of the systems, not on the relational type of things, but so we wrote the paper recently as some of us here, and we couldn't help it but add the hype curve into the paper. And the hype curve, as you well know, is the adoption, new technology adoption, and we are probably in the midst of the hype, and there will be a trough of disillusionment, and we will eventually get to some production phase. So do you have, is that part of the strategic thinking here? I mean, what if in 3-5 years we are off the wagon on AI, and what is the sustainability of this
So
moving forward?
yeah, so I think there is going to be paths forward. So I talked about that sort of this hybrid approach of sort of knowledge-based AI, which I personally believe is going to be the future of this. I'll also say AI is not new, right? We've been doing artificial neural networks since the 1940s. And there's always been so what I have in the past defined AI as the thing you just can't do yet, right? Because the field has been evolving for decades, right? And so there's big hype right now on these particular models, but I don't think the field is going away, right? There's decades of value from this area. And so it may not have the same attention it's getting now, but there's still going to be scientific value and there's still going to be practical value in the world for a very long time moving forward.
But the downside of that is that there won't be resources as they are now. So therefore, over investing on something that might not be continuing for a very long time is risky, because whenever the attention span of our powers that be,
Yeah.
they move away from this, and there is all this that was
You know, there's always changes in funding levels, but I think making tools that help people solve problems is a constant need. And I don't think we're ever gonna go away from computational tools, right? And knowledge-based systems, mechanistic models, AI, I think the future is them combined to create these tools.
I mean, we have some cautionary tales. I mean, for example, we had the big search of bioenergy. Remember, as time back, and whole labs were created with people, and lots of resources were put into that. And then all of a sudden, these people are now, the labs are pretty much abandoned, or they cannot get funding, and it was not really sustainable. We just right away, kind of fall into something that eventually was gonna fizzle out, and it was an economics problem. So, yeah, something like that. This is what I'm worrying a little bit about, we should keep it in mind, at least in planning and strategy. Yeah.
Well, I think it is important to not tie too closely to any one approach. It's to think broadly, and I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But there's going to be future corrections in this. It may be termed differently or packaged differently, but I think there's always going to be work related in some way. It is going to evolve over time. So I agree. Are there questions from the Zoom audience?
Yep.
Yes.
I was wondering for the histogram features, when you have your soft histogram layer. So I was wondering, you compared it to convolutional networks. I was wondering if you compared it to vision transformers as well. It's thinking about it. Obviously, I've only thought about it for like 30 seconds, but it seems like that there could be differences there in terms of how they interpret images.
Yeah, so I think that's a good comparison to make. We've really focused on it as like, how does this feature set within an architecture compared to another feature set? Transformer architectures are very high in number of parameters, and histogram layer is not. So that in that sense, they're very different. But I think just like you have transformers for computer vision, those transformers can incorporate feature layers or histogram layers within them. So I don't think it's necessarily a competing model. It's something that can be, just like a convolution is very generic and incorporated in many architectures. This could be incorporated in many architectures as well. But I think comparisons make sense. We just have not done those yet.
I was thinking more along those lines too. There's potentially some room for combining the two together.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, so Spencer's carrying out a whole bunch of comparison experiments, probably not that one in particular, but I think there's a lot of room of like, where can we put this and how can we put it well? Yeah, absolutely.
I thought that was exciting. I remember reading a paper years ago about like LRB and CNN combinations, which never really went anywhere. So it's nice to see that there's still progress being made.
Cool, great.
Alina, I have a couple of questions. Yeah, first, as an electrical engineer, you have worked on the agriculture domain for many years. So I also talked to some the computer scientists and electrical engineers, and sometimes they think agriculture, computer vision tasks are relatively simple. Some people think that. So I want to get your view. How do you think these agriculture vision tasks? Are they simpler than general computer vision tasks or more challenging? That's the first question. The second question is, this year Nobel Prize was given to AI for two prizes, right? Physics and chemistry. So in your opinion, what's the next, disruptive AI technology that can have a huge impact on agriculture science?
Yeah, so thank you. So I absolutely believe that there are very hard challenges in the ag space. And I think we just need to do a better job of making those problems accessible to the computer science community and clearly explaining what those challenges are. And probably us at UF are best situated to be able to do that. I've heard similar things. I've sent papers into computer vision oriented conferences, and it's not given the same attention. But, there's increasing number of workshops that are sort of added, you'll have your pre-workshops to the big conference that are focused on agriculture and related areas. And so I think there's slowly more attention being given to them and probably making large data sets accessible and clarifying exactly this is why our current AI tools don't solve this problem will help. So going back to my comments to Rafa, I think the next big disruptive thing is how do we combine the knowledge we know about the world with data, right? Our big models right now are we're going to learn everything about the world from scratch using data, which is, we shouldn't do that. We know stuff already, and we're continuing to learn more. We need to figure out how we can take the knowledge we have about the world and embed them within these AI and deep learning architectures. And I think ways to do that would be very hugely advance the field, right? There's been work in, there's different terms for it, physics constrained AI or physics guided AI. It tends to be a very narrow set of types of knowledge. Like here's an equation that we must be constrained to follow in the network, right? But not all knowledge is like that, right? So I've been in enough conversations with producers where we'll give rules of thumb, right? Or in the forest ecology work, these trees tend to grow next to each other, but not always, right? How do we take those rules of thumb or these more, I guess, less hard pieces of knowledge and also use that to guide, right? How do we take our crop models or our mechanistic models and either embed AI in them to improve them for transferring to new environments or new species, or put them as a base for models also taking data and adapt those accordingly. I think this sort of hybrid knowledge guided AI is a big area. I think it's wide open, lots to do there.
I have a quick question. I'm probably the most ignorant in AI in this room. And Nikolai will have to forgive me because I'm probably gonna say a hair.
I'm not an AI person, I'm a stats person.
But that's why you are gonna not forgive me. I mean, so I love the title of your presentation. And the I don't know has to me two connotations, right? In order for me to be able to say I don't know, there is whether I have sufficient information or whether I'm honest about what I'm saying. So in an AI model, right, you have some quantitative way of saying, oh yeah, this is it. And no, this is not it. There is a number that my model throws out that tells me this is, you have those matrices, tells me, yeah, this is reliable. So the question is, why is the algorithm dishonest and is saying, yes, it is, while it is not? So is there an additional layer of honesty when these things are created?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I think that's why there's this whole area in the field of uncertainty estimation and competency awareness is these models only know what we've taught them to know. So if we've taught a model to detect cats versus dogs, it doesn't know what an elephant is. You show it an elephant, it's gonna say dog 100%.
So, and that's the way we question things, right? When sensory analysis in food, right? If I give you two samples and I ask you, tell me which one is best or better than the other one, right? But I give you the same samples. I'm forcing you to tell me which one is the best. So is there a way of querying the system so that to tell them, if you don't know, tell me you don't know?
Yeah.
Are we forcing the system to give me an output that does really have this hallucination?
Yeah, so I think in the past leading up to this point, we've forced an output. But for the past several years, and a growing community is trying to do exactly what you're saying. How can we say, I don't know in all these different flavors? How can we say, here's my answer and here's how confident I am. Here's why I'm confident, right? There's a large area of explainable AI. To do that, this is why I'm making the decision. There's a whole field of work in this outlier detection to say, this is not something I've seen before. Here's my output, but I don't know because I've never seen anything like this before. So that, I guess there's many different flavors of this competency awareness. There's this identifying outliers, there's ambiguity in the samples, right? Like I think it's this class, but I'm not 100% certain, and here's my reasoning. All those things are being studied, right? The traditional models have no way of doing them, but there's increasingly more methods being developed to try to address that. And my belief, and I think most will agree, and probably have said this before me, is no one of those methods is going to work alone. You're going to need a whole, just like we have these massive LLMs, we're going to have this massive uncertainty competency awareness system that goes alongside it to bring all these together and say, here's my competence, here's whether I'm lying or not on this one sample. So it's just active work, but it's very active. It's a big area. There's entire conferences. Absolutely.
Well, let's thank our guest speaker again.